Some nightmares fade with the sunrise. Others follow people into the real world, turning ordinary lives into something far more sinister. What you're about to hear isn't fiction, and it isn't softened for comfort. These are moments where the boundary between sleep and reality dissolved, leaving behind truths more disturbing than any dream could warn against. Every story comes from someone who thought nightmares were harmless, until they learned how violently wrong that belief can be. Today we're exploring 5 true horror stories born directly from real nightmares. And if the first one chills you, the next will haunt you even more. She always believed dreams were simply the brain clearing out its clutter, nothing more than echoes of stress and memory. But for nearly a month, she kept having the same nightmare, one where someone stood over her bed, not touching, not speaking, just staring with a stillness too deliberate to be human. Each night the figure seemed closer, sharper, clearer in detail, as though her mind was slowly adjusting a lens. She would wake covered in sweat, heart racing, convinced the nightmare would lose its edge by morning. Instead, it began to follow her through her days. The dread didn't arrive all at once. It crept. She started noticing a sensation behind her shoulder, like someone leaning in to read over it. A cold pressure formed in her chest whenever she entered her bedroom. Her sleep became a battleground she kept losing. Every time her eyes closed, the nightmare continued exactly where it left off, as if pausing only when she woke and resuming the moment she slipped under again. She tried changing the arrangement of her room, shifting her bed, buying new pillows, adjusting the lights, anything to break the loop, but the figure in her dreams remained fixed in its chilling patience. By the 3rd week, she recognized its posture so well she began anticipating it before sleep even claimed her. She started dozing in short, accidental intervals during the day, and in those micro-sleeps the nightmare grew bolder. She began seeing glimpses of the figure even with her eyes half open, as though her brain no longer knew how to separate waking life from the dream. Then one night, exhaustion forced her into a deep, unavoidable sleep. It began the same way. Her room, the faint glow of the streetlight through the blinds, and the figure standing near her dresser. But something was different. This time the figure wasn't still. Its head tilted, slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet waiting for a command. She tried to force herself awake, but felt something pinning her down, not with hands, but with an overwhelming heaviness, as if gravity itself was being controlled. The figure stepped closer, and she realized her nightmare had never been symbolic or psychological. It had been observational. Something had been learning her, studying her reactions, timing its movements to her fear. When it finally reached the side of her bed, it leaned forward, and for the first time she saw what she mistook for a face dissolve into something shapeless, like a smear of darkness absorbing all the light around it. The moment its presence reached the edge of her breathing space, she broke free and woke with a violent gasp. She bolted upright to find her room cold enough to see her breath. The streetlight outside flickered as though reacting to something unseen. And there, by the dresser, was the unmistakable impression of someone having stood there, a long, human-shaped shadow cast where no person should have been. It stretched toward her, still and patient, exactly like in her dreams. She didn't sleep in that room again, but the nightmare didn't stop. Even in new places, the figure returned, each time closer than before. She realized then the most terrifying truth: some dreams don't warn you, they follow you. If this story unsettled you, the next story will drag you even deeper into the kind of nightmare that doesn't just linger, it hunts. The nightmares began for him in childhood, but back then they were only fragments, brief flashes of drowning in darkness, of walls closing in, of something brushing his ankle under the bed. As he grew older, the dreams vanished, replaced by the normal stresses of adulthood. But on the night of his 29th birthday, the nightmares returned with a violence that felt less like memory and more like a warning. It started with the dream of a staircase he didn't recognize. It spiraled downward endlessly, lit only by the faintest glow from somewhere far below. He felt pulled toward it, even though every instinct told him that nothing good waited at the bottom. Yet the dream forced him down step by step. There was no sound except his own breathing, and the deeper he descended, the more the air thickened around him as if he were walking into a vacuum. The staircase narrowed until his shoulders scraped the cold walls, and then the steps simply ended, not in a floor, but in a drop so black and deep it felt alive. He fell into that darkness, tumbling without weight, without direction, without the certainty that he would ever stop. Just before he hit something solid, he jolted awake, gasping, drenched in sweat. He told himself it was stress, that the subconscious was unpredictable, that falling dreams meant nothing. But the next night the staircase returned, this time with new details. The faint glow below pulsed like a heartbeat, and a sound rose from the depths, a slow, rhythmic scraping like stone dragged across stone. On the third night, he reached the bottom. He didn't fall. He stepped onto a flat, cold surface covered in dust thick enough to disturb in waves. The faint glow came from cracks in the ground, thin slivers of red light pulsing like veins beneath the earth. He felt watched by something he couldn't see but sensed clearly. Then from beyond the darkness, the scraping sound drew closer. It wasn't hurried. It was steady, deliberate, like something confident he would not escape. He forced himself awake by sheer panic, but by then the lines separating dream from reality had thinned. That morning his apartment felt colder, the corners darker. When he walked to the kitchen, the floor creaked under him in a way it never had before. On the tiles by the sink, he noticed a trail of dust, thin and powdery, identical to the dust he had stepped on in his dream. He stared at it for a long time before brushing it away, hoping it was just residue from outside, something explainable. The following night he tried to stay awake, drinking coffee until his hands shook, but eventually exhaustion won. The dream came instantly, dropping him into the staircase mid-descent. The scraping sound was already close, echoing up the stairwell. His feet moved faster on their own, driven by panic. But no matter how fast he climbed, the top of the stairs never approached. Then something began climbing behind him. He felt vibrations in the steps, subtle but unmistakable. The scraping grew louder, turning into a dragging, pulling rhythm. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel its presence like heat against his spine. His breathing became shallow. His legs moved until they burned. But the staircase twisted endlessly ahead of him, the same turn repeating, looping, trapping him. He woke falling out of his bed, hitting the floor with such force that he struggled to breathe. And that's when he heard something that froze him completely. The scraping sound continuing for a split second after he opened his eyes, as if something was finishing a step before stopping. He didn't sleep for 2 days after that, but lack of sleep didn't protect him. Instead, the dream began creeping into the edges of his vision. He caught glimpses of the red glow beneath floorboards. He heard faint scraping when he walked through hallways. Once, as he stood in his bathroom mirror, his reflection seemed to lean slightly out of sync, as though it were delayed by a fraction of a second. On the 5th night, reality finally gave way. He saw the staircase behind him in the reflection, perfectly clear, descending into an endless void. And rising through it, just behind his shoulder, was the thing that had been climbing toward him all along, its shape impossible to fully understand, as if built from darkness that refused to hold still. The lights flickered, the mirror trembled, and the nightmare reached him. If this story disturbed you, the next one will make the boundary between dreaming and waking feel even more fragile. Because the third story comes from someone who discovered that the things we see at night sometimes see us back. She had always been a deep sleeper, the kind of person who could drift off anywhere, anytime. But after moving into her new apartment, something began to disturb her rest. Not loudly, not violently, but with a subtlety that felt intentional. It started with faint sensations of being observed as she slept, as though the air itself thickened near her bed. At first, she blamed the stress of relocating, the unfamiliar hum of new pipes, the settling of floors. But the presence didn't fade. It grew more focused. She began dreaming of standing in her own bedroom, watching herself sleep. In the dream, she couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't blink. She could only stare at her own still body under the blankets. The room looked exactly as it did in reality. The same shadows, the same flickering streetlight outside, the same pale glow of the alarm clock. Nothing was distorted or surreal, and that was the most terrifying part. It wasn't a dreamscape. It was her room exactly as it was. Night after night, the dream repeated. Sometimes she stood at the foot of her bed, sometimes near the door, but always frozen in place while her sleeping body remained unaware. As the dream extended, she started noticing changes in her surroundings. A picture frame faced the wrong direction. A drawer stood slightly open. A piece of clothing on the floor had moved a few inches. Tiny details that weren't there before. At first, she thought her brain was just filling in blanks. But one morning, she woke to find the picture frame actually turned. The drawer actually cracked open. The piece of clothing actually shifted. Her heart sank with the realization. Her dream self wasn't observing random changes. It was observing something changing the room. On the seventh night, the dream altered. Instead of simply standing and watching, she sensed someone else in the room with her. Not a figure she could see, more like a weight in the air behind her, a pressure that made the room feel smaller and colder. She could feel it moving, slow and deliberate, circling her sleeping body. She tried to force herself out of the dream, tried to break the paralysis, but she remained trapped, forced to watch as the unseen presence slid nearer to her physical form. When she finally woke, she found her blanket pulled slightly off the bed, trailing onto the floor like something had tugged it during the night. She stared at it for a long time before carefully folding it back, telling herself it must have been her own restlessness. But in her chest, she felt a truth she didn't want to acknowledge. The dreams escalated. In one, she found herself standing in the exact same position, but this time she wasn't alone. A dark outline hovered just inches behind her dream body's shoulder. It wasn't shaped like a person, not fully. Its edges were too soft, too fluid, like darkness caught mid-motion. Though it had no face, its attention felt suffocating, aimed both at her sleeping self and her dream self simultaneously, as if studying her from two planes at once. She woke that night gasping, her heart hammering so violently she felt dizzy. She turned on every light in the apartment and sat upright until dawn, refusing to close her eyes for even a second. But exhaustion is a predator that always wins. When she finally succumbed to sleep the next afternoon, the dream resumed instantly. There was no buildup, no familiar shift, only darkness, dense and consuming. Then, slowly, the room faded back into view, but something was horribly wrong. Her dream self was not standing. She was lying beside her own sleeping body on the bed, positioned exactly like a corpse prepared for burial. She couldn't move. She couldn't avert her eyes. She could only watch as a shadowy mass rose from the floor beside the bed, its shape spilling upward like smoke being sucked in reverse. It hovered above her sleeping form, bending, lowering, reaching, not with hands, but with a presence that pressed against the air like a physical force. The shadow leaned so close that its darkness spilled across her sleeping face, drowning it, enveloping it. And for the first time, she understood what the dreams had been showing her all along. It wasn't watching her. It was learning how to take her place. She woke with a violent jolt, choking on a gasp, and for a split second, she didn't feel fully inside her own body. Her limbs responded a heartbeat too late. Her vision lagged as if something else were adjusting to her eyes. When she stood and looked in the mirror, her reflection blinked a fraction slower than she did, as though still catching up or still settling in. If this story made you uneasy, the next one will shake you even deeper, because the fourth nightmare proves that sometimes the things we see while half asleep aren't imagined at all. He had always considered himself rational, grounded, immune to superstition. His job demanded it. Long late shifts at a hospital, steady hands, clear thinking, no room for fear or imagination. He spent years surrounded by sickness, silence, and fluorescent lights that washed everything pale. But none of it bothered him the way the nights would soon begin to. It started during a half-hour break. Exhausted from hours on his feet, he sat in the staff lounge and let his eyes fall shut. He wasn't fully asleep. Not fully awake, just drifting in that strange middle space where the world becomes distorted. In that blurry state, he sensed motion in the room even though he knew he was alone. The light seemed to dim, not from the bulb but from something passing in front of it. A cold heaviness pressed the air down, and his half-sleeping mind tried to dismiss it as fatigue. But then he felt a weight settle into the chair across from him. Not a soft shift, not the settling of furniture, an intentional presence lowering itself, affecting even the air around it. His body jolted awake, but when his eyes snapped open, the chair was empty. The room was silent. Nothing moved. The clock ticked normally. Yet the heaviness stayed with him. Over the next week, he began drifting into micro-sleeps without meaning to. Stress, exhaustion, or something far stranger was wearing him down. And every time his consciousness slipped, even for a second, the same presence returned. Always just out of sight, always just close enough to feel. It began to follow him beyond the lounge, down hallways, through patient rooms, into elevators where the air suddenly felt crowded, though no one else was inside. Then came the first nightmare. He found himself in the hospital hallway, but it was silent in a way that felt wrong. No machines, no distant voices, no footsteps. The lights flickered just enough to reveal shapes in the peripheral edges of vision, shadows shifting as though stepping away every time he tried to look. When he turned a corner, he saw a gurney in the middle of the hall. It was empty, but the sheet draped across it pulsed slightly, as if something beneath it breathed. He stepped closer, not by choice, but because the dream pulled him, and the sheet slowly lifted at the corner, rising as though an unseen hand pinched it from underneath. A darkness spilled out from beneath it, crawling down the gurney legs like slow-moving liquid. The corridor began stretching longer, deeper, while the lights dimmed one by one in a steady sequence, like something was approaching step by step. He woke with a start at the nurse's station, head down, seconds from falling off the chair. His coworkers hadn't noticed him drifting off, but someone had placed a patient sheet on the floor next to him, neatly folded, perfectly smooth. He stared at it, unable to understand how it got there, or why seeing it filled him with a dread so sharp it made his hands shake. From that day forward, his dreams became clearer and worse. Each night he found himself deeper in the silent hospital, always alone, always walking hallways that stretched impossibly long, and always sensing something following him, not chasing, just observing, watching him lose himself, watching him weaken. The presence waited patiently, knowing he would break long before it needed to approach. His waking life began to fray. He moved slower, spoke less, felt the weight of eyes on him even in crowds. He stopped looking into reflective surfaces because he began catching glimpses of a shape standing too close behind him. Just a shadow at first, then a darker outline, then something tall enough that it eclipsed his entire figure. On the seventh night, the nightmare changed. He wasn't in a hallway. He was lying on a hospital bed covered by a sheet. He could see the fabric through it, like he wasn't fully inside his own body. He felt something beside the bed, towering, bending closer. The sheet tightened around his chest as the presence pressed down, heavier and heavier, like it was testing how deeply it could sink into him. His heart slammed him awake, but something was wrong. The room was freezing. The monitors around him, machines that shouldn't have been running, flickered, their lights forming a steady pulse. And at the far corner of the room, the sheet he had seen folded now drooped over the edge of the counter, as if something had lifted it, examined it, and then dropped it again. He didn't return to work after that shift. He didn't sleep for days. But when he finally closed his eyes from sheer exhaustion, he found himself back on the hospital gurney. But this time, he wasn't the one lying under the sheet. The presence was, and it was getting up. If this story shook you, the final story will take you into a nightmare that didn't just cross into reality, it replaced it. The fifth story goes even deeper into terror. She had never been prone to nightmares. Her dreams, if she remembered them at all, were ordinary fragments, blurred faces, unfinished thoughts, fading landscapes. But after a severe bout of insomnia, something in her sleep changed. It didn't happen slowly or subtly. It arrived all at once, like a switch flipping inside her mind. One night she went to bed exhausted, desperate to rest, and what she found in that sleep would become the most horrifying experience of her life. The dream began with silence. Not peaceful silence, but hollow, suffocating silence, the kind that made her aware of her own breathing. She stood in a vast, empty field under a sky that held no stars, no moon, just a dull gray glow without a source. The grass beneath her feet felt damp, cold, and strangely soft, like it had never been touched by sunlight. She looked around, seeking familiar shapes, landmarks, anything, but the field stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no wind, no birds, no movement, just stillness. Then she noticed something far in the distance, a structure that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a house, but distorted. Too tall, too narrow, leaning slightly as though the ground struggled to hold its weight. The windows were pitch black, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. A faint pull tugged at her, an urge to walk toward it. She didn't want to, but the dream drew her closer with every breath. As she approached, she realized the house wasn't abandoned. It felt aware. The air around it thickened, pressing against her skin like an invisible force. With every step, her heartbeat grew louder, echoing in the emptiness. She reached the front door, an impossibly tall frame with wood that seemed rotten yet freshly wet, as if something inside had seeped into it. She tried to step back, but her body wouldn't listen. The dream had decided her direction. The door opened on its own. Inside, the house was darker than the night outside. Not a darkness caused by lack of light, but a living darkness, dense and shifting. She could barely see her own hands, yet she felt the walls around her, strangely close, as if the corridor were breathing. The floorboards creaked with each step, not beneath her, but ahead of her, as though someone else were walking first, guiding her deeper. She followed the invisible path until she reached a room with a faint glow. It came from a single object in the center, a mirror. Tall, cracked down the middle, with a frame that pulsed subtly like a heartbeat. She felt herself gravitating toward it, compelled to look despite the dread rising in her chest. When she finally raised her eyes to the glass, her reflection didn't show her standing in a dark room. It showed her lying in her bed at home, the sheets pulled high, her face pale, her chest rising and falling slowly as if she were in a deep, unnatural sleep. She leaned closer to the mirror, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then her reflection's eyes opened. Not her eyes, something wearing her gaze. The reflection smiled subtly, the smallest, wrongest curve of the lips. Her body in the reflection shifted, stretching, adjusting itself under the blankets like settling into a body that wasn't originally its own. She stumbled back from the mirror, heart stammering. The reflection continued to watch her, fully awake now, movements smooth and confident, nothing like her own panic trembling. As she stared in terror, the reflection raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like water. She turned to run, but the house around her twisted. Corridors bent into new shapes, doorways sealed shut. The floor rippled like breathing skin. The dream collapsed into chaos, dragging her back toward the mirror with a force she couldn't fight. She clawed at the ground, but the darkness beneath her surged upward like hands pulling her in. The last thing she saw was her reflection stepping out of the mirror, its movement smooth, confident, unhurried. While she was dragged into the glass, into the reflection's world, trapped in its place. She woke with a scream, but stopped instantly. She wasn't in her bed. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. And the person now sitting up in her body, breathing with her lungs, looking through her eyes, wasn't her. If the previous stories haunted your thoughts, this final one reminds us that nightmares don't always stay contained. Sometimes they slip into the waking world and take something with them. Nightmares don't end when the stories stop. They linger in the shadows, waiting for the next quiet moment to return. If these real-life horrors shook you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so more people can step into the darkness with us. More terrifying stories await.